tension between deontology and teleology is undoubtedly one of the central dilemmas of moral philosophy, and confronting it is like stepping into a constantly contested terrain. On one side, deontology asserts itself with the firmness of an ethics based on universal rules and duties, exemplified in the work of Immanuel Kant, where correct actions are those that adhere to rational and unalterable principles. On the other hand, teleology, more flexible in its approach, suggests that the morality of an action is determined by the result it produces, as defended by John Stuart Mill in his utilitarian theory. Between these two poles, there are those who have sought a balance or an intermediate path. William David Ross, for example, introduced the notion of prima facie duties, recognizing that our obligations can come into conflict and require ethical judgment on a case-by-case basis. Derek Parfit, in his analysis of identity and ethics, proposes new ways of thinking about conflicts between values. Philippa Foot and Thomas Nagel, each in their own way, delve into the nuances of human behavior, exploring the dilemmas that arise when principles and consequences intertwine. These philosophical ideas gain a visceral dimension in the fictional universe, especially in the character of Harry Callahan from the film Dirty Harry from 1971. Callahan is not just a detective, he is a man positioned on the threshold between duty and necessity, carrying the weight of choices that resonate far beyond the scope of his immediate actions. As the guardian of the law, he is formally bound to follow the codes that should ensure justice and order. But at the same time, he faces a reality where these rules often seem insufficient, or even an obstacle to the greater good. With each confrontation, with every decision made under pressure, the moral dilemma intensifies. Callahan acts with a toughness that challenges the limits of traditional ethics, his methods overflowing the boundaries of what deontology would approve. However, it is impossible to ignore the almost brutal pragmatism of his choices, guided by a relentless view of teleology, where evil must be fought at any cost. This tension transforms him into a figure that is both admirable and unsettling, a mirror of human complexity itself. He is both anti-hero and anti-villain, someone who challenges viewers to confront their own understanding of what it supposedly means to do the right thing. His actions do not offer easy answers, they reveal the whirlwind of emotions and reasoning that arises when inflexible principles clash with the urgency of the outcome. The film's ethical drama is not just a story, it is an invitation to reflect on the contradictions that reside at the core of morality. Before anything else, let us lay the foundation of two key branches of ethics, deontology and teleology. Let us begin this foundation with the absolute deontology of Immanuel Kant. Kantian deontology is understood as an ethical framework deeply rooted in universal principles and inalienable duties, presented by Immanuel Kant in Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals from 1785 and refined in Critique of Practical Reason from 1788. Within this theoretical structure, Kant seeks to define a morality that transcends subjective inclinations, variable circumstances, and the whims of outcomes. For him, morality resides in pure rationality, expressed through the categorical imperative, a universal principle that determines the correctness of an action by examining whether its maxim can be universalized without contradiction. In its most famous formulation, Kant declares, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law." This principle not only establishes a rational criterion for evaluating the morality of specific actions, but also reinforces the idea that humans, as rational agents, possess intrinsic dignity. Kant argues that this dignity requires us to treat individuals always as ends in themselves, never as means to achieve external goals. This view reflects an ethics that prioritizes autonomy and rationality, recognizing in the human being an absolute value that cannot be relativized. Kant's categorical rejection of morality based on consequences is a central point of his philosophy. He argues that subordinating morality to outcomes would undermine the autonomy of the rational agent, transforming them into a mere instrument for contingent purposes. To illustrate this position, he presents a classic example regarding truthfulness in an extreme situation. Imagine an individual being pursued by a murderer and lying would be the only way to save their life. Still, Kant insists that lying is immoral as this maxim cannot be universalized without contradiction. Lying, in any circumstance, would compromise social trust and violate the principle that truth must be preserved as a universal norm. Contemporary Kantian philosophers, such as 𝕸𝖐𝖆𝖊𝑑 𝕾𝖙𝖗𝖎𝖌𝖔𝑛, emphasize that this approach not only protects fundamental rights, but also promotes an ethical system that avoids dangerous exceptions that could erode universal morality. We now turn to the utilitarian teleology of John Stuart Mill. Mill's approach to refining teleological ethics can be understood as an attempt to elevate morality to a level where human well-being, understood in terms of general happiness, occupies the center of ethical decisions. In utilitarianism from 1863, Mill continues Jeremy Bentham's theory, but significantly adjusts it, offering nuances that make it more comprehensive and sophisticated. He argues that not all pleasures hold the same value, whereas Bentham treated pleasure uniformly. Mill makes a fundamental distinction between higher pleasures such as intellectual and moral ones and lower pleasures, which are more sensory in nature. For Mill, higher pleasures are qualitatively more important because they contribute more deeply to human fulfillment and progress. The central principle of his ethics is the greatest happiness principle, which posits that an action is morally right if it promotes the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This view, however, is not purely utilitarian in terms of quantity. Mill acknowledges that well-being includes qualitative aspects such as justice, which he explores in his essay on liberty from 1859. Here, Mill introduces the idea of utilitarian justice, where individual liberties are not just rights, but essential components for maximizing collective well-being. He defends, for example, freedom of expression, even in the case of erroneous opinions, because he believes that suppressing ideas, no matter how mistaken they may seem, harms intellectual and social progress, depriving society of a critical debate that is essential for its development. The theoretical applications of Mill's utilitarianism provide a solid foundation for addressing contemporary ethical dilemmas. A relevant example is the trolley problem, where the morality of sacrificing one life to save five is discussed. Theorists influenced by Mill, such as Peter Singer, apply the greatest happiness principle to argue that such a sacrifice can be justified, as long as it maximizes overall well-being. This type of analysis reveals the practical flexibility of utilitarianism, but also highlights its limits and tensions when confronted with more complex issues such as the equality of rights and the intrinsic value of individuals. When comparing Mill to other philosophical approaches, the difference from Kantian deontology becomes clear. While Kant prioritizes universal principles and the intrinsic justice of the action, Mill focuses on the results, evaluating morality based on consequences. He also distinguishes himself from Bentham's classical utilitarianism by introducing a qualitative hierarchy between pleasures, moving away from a mechanistic and simplistic view of ethics. By incorporating these differences, Mill offers a theory that seeks to balance the pursuit of happiness with a sense of justice and human dignity, enriching the philosophical debate on what constitutes a morally significant life. We now arrive at the prima facie duties of William David Ross's deontology. Ross's proposal in The Right and the Good from 1930 represents an attempt to overcome the limitations of both Kantian rigidity and absolute consequentialism. Ross challenges the view that moral obligations must be followed inflexibly, either as universal and immutable duties, as Kant suggests, or with exclusive focus on consequences, as in Mill's utilitarianism. He introduces the concept of prima facie duties, which are meaningful moral obligations, but not absolute. These duties, such as fidelity, reparation, gratitude, justice, beneficence, non-maleficence, and self-improvement, represent ethical commitments that must be considered for their relevance within specific contexts. According to Ross, in situations of moral conflict, a careful assessment must be made to determine which prima facie duty takes precedence over others, taking into account the particularity of the context. This requires a form of moral discernment, as there is no universal rule for all situations. Moral judgment must be sensitive to the complexity of circumstances so that decisions are not made solely based on general rules, but through a considered analysis of the competing obligations at play. A practical example of how this works is the case of an individual who promises to visit a sick friend but, on the way, encounters an accident and realizes that the victims require immediate help. In terms of prima facie duties, the duty of beneficence, helping the injured, may override the duty of fidelity, keeping the promise since the immediate well-being of the victims is more urgent in the context. This example illustrates the idea that a person's moral obligations are not absolute. They can be prioritized according to the situation at hand, with moral discernment determining which duty is more pressing at the moment. In relation to other ethical theories, Ross's approach is distinguished by preserving the plurality of moral obligations, rejecting the monistic view of Kant and Mill, who attempt to reduce morality to a single principle or objective. In contrast to these approaches, Ross argues that morality is multifaceted and requires a richer, more practical analysis. His theory also emphasizes the importance of practical discernment, a crucial element that cannot be reduced to inflexible rules or mechanistic calculations. Thus, his view acknowledges the complexity of moral life and the need for a more adaptive approach that is sensitive to the nuances of everyday reality. We now proceed with the ethical compatibilism of 𝕸𝖎𝖐𝖊𝑑 𝕸𝖎𝖐𝖊𝑑 ethical worldview as presented in Reasons and Persons 1984 represents an audacious attempt to reconcile two seemingly antagonistic ethical traditions, consequentialism and deontologism. Parfit seeks a more flexible, reason-guided approach, acknowledging that depending on the type of moral dilemma faced, both principles and consequences play a crucial role. He understands that in certain situations, deontological principles may be essential to ensure justice and individual rights, while in others, considering consequences should prevail to maximize overall well-being. This flexibility allows for a more pragmatic application of ethics adapted to the complexities of real-life moral dilemmas. One of Parfit's greatest legacies is his exploration of the classic trolley problem, where the moral justification of sacrificing one life to save 5 others is debated. Parfit suggests that although deontological values such as the protection of life and individual rights should be preserved, they can coexist with consequentialist concerns. In other words, the morality of an action should not be determined solely by its final outcome, but also by a careful consideration of fundamental principles that cannot be violated without causing significant harm to the ethical framework we uphold. This hybrid approach aims to avoid the extremes of pure deontological and consequentialist positions, creating a model that accommodates the complexities and tensions inherent in moral decision-making. In his theoretical applications, Parfit examines the dilemma of existential risk reduction, where the question is raised as to whether the massive allocation of resources in the present to save billions of future lives can be morally justified. Parfit argues that while consequentialism is useful for guiding the initial analysis and helping us calculate the possible consequences of our actions, it is also crucial to consider the moral implications of sacrificing individual rights in the process. In this context, he recognizes the need for a balance between the rights of present generations and the promises made to future ones, an issue he believes requires an approach that combines both principles and consequences. Parfit's main contribution in relation to other theories is overcoming the antagonism between deontology and teleology. He proposes a hybrid model that emphasizes the importance of contextual moral judgment, adapted to the demands and complexities of each situation. His perspective rejects both Kantian rigidity, which prevents any moral flexibility, and the indiscriminate application of utilitarianism, which may, in the name of collective well-being, sacrifice fundamental values such as individual rights. In this way, Parfit offers an alternative that seeks to integrate the best features of both philosophical traditions, aiming for a more just and realistic ethical balance. Now, we still have the ethics of virtues and contexts according to 𝕸𝖎𝖐𝖊𝑑 view. I understand 𝕸𝖎𝖐𝖊𝑑's proposal in Virtues and Vices and Other Essays in Moral Philosophy from 1978 and Natural Goodness from 2001 as an essential reformulation of virtue ethics, which is directly inspired by the Aristotelic tradition. For Foote, morality cannot be judged from abstract rules or calculations of consequences, it must be analyzed in light of human virtues, which reveal themselves in a practical and contextual way. Virtues such as justice, temperance, and courage are not absolute or rigid, but adaptable to the reality of everyday situations. Each action should be considered not in isolation, but in relation to the context and the human capacities involved. Foote criticizes ethical theories like Kantian deontology, which overlooks the essential role of context and the circumstances in which moral actions unfold, and utilitarianism, which tries to reduce morality to a simple calculation of benefits and harms. She views these approaches as overly mechanistic and disregards the human character of moral decisions. In contrast, Foote proposes a morality centered on human flourishing, the development of virtues, and the pursuit of a fully realized life taking into account human nature and its complexities. In terms of theoretical applications, Foote presents examples such as the case of a doctor who, faced with an emergency, decides to sacrifice a terminally ill patient to save 5 others in need of organ transplants. While utilitarianism could justify this action based on a consequentialist calculation to maximize well-being, Foote argues that such a decision would compromise fundamental virtues such as justice and temperance. The doctor's action, sacrificing one life for a supposed greater good, would violate respect for the dignity of each individual and the need for balanced judgment. For Foote, morality is not limited to numerical outcomes or abstract principles. It requires a deep evaluation of the virtues that must be cultivated in each situation. Foote's difference from other ethical theories lies precisely in the focus she gives to the moral character of the agent, rather than simply evaluating isolated actions or their results. She rejects Kant's universalist rigor, which demands an inflexible application of moral principles, and Mill's teleological objectivity, which prioritizes results over motivations. Instead, Foote emphasizes the virtuous balance that a morally competent agent must seek, considering both the virtues they must cultivate and the nuances of each moral context. In this way, her theory proposes a more flexible morality attentive to the complexities of human life and the development of character, rather than adhering to fixed rules or the calculation of consequences. Finally, we have the moral dualism of Thomas Nagel. Nagel's reflection in The View from Nowhere 1986 presents a profound analysis of the conflict between two fundamental moral perspectives, the subjective based on personal and contextual values, and the objective, grounded in universal and impartial principles. Thomas Nagel proposes that morality cannot be fully understood if we consider only one of these perspectives in isolation. He argues that to adequately address ethical issues, it is necessary to integrate these two dimensions, the subjective, which takes into account emotions and personal interests, and the objective, which seeks impartial justice and universal principles. One of Nagel's central concepts is that of moral tragedy, which occurs when a morally necessary decision inevitably violates some significant ethical obligation. He explores the tension between these two perspectives in complex scenarios such as war and punishment, where subjective reasons, like context and the emotions involved, collide with the demand for impartial justice represented by the objective principles of morality. Nagel recognizes that these situations often result in moral dilemmas where there is no simple or fully just solution, but where an honest confrontation with the complexity of reality is necessary. In terms of theoretical applications, Nagel illustrates his viewpoint with discussions on bombings during wars, where there is a clear tension between military necessity, the subjective perspective, and universal principles of not causing harm to civilians, the objective perspective. In situations like these, he points out that ethical dilemmas are inevitably tragic as any action taken seems to violate some fundamental moral principle. However, Nagel insists that despite the tragedy of these decisions, they must be confronted with moral responsibility, recognizing that human morality often requires the sacrifice of some values in favor of others, but without losing sight of the need to reflect deeply on the consequences of each choice. The fundamental difference between Nagel and other ethical theories such as Kantian deontology and Mill's utilitarianism lies in his emphasis on the psychological and emotional dimensions of moral dilemmas. While Kant and Mill tend to focus on rules or consequences themselves, Nagel distinguishes himself by considering the motivations and feelings of moral agents as crucial aspects of decision-making. He also rejects simplistic answers to ethical problems, preferring to confront complexity and ambiguity as an inevitable characteristic of the human condition. In this way, Nagel offers an approach that not only recognizes the complexity of moral dilemmas, but also invites us to reflect on the limitations of any ethical system that seeks easy or definitive solutions. With the foundations and explorations of various worldviews properly laid out, we can now analyze the film Dirty Harry and the actions of its protagonist with much greater clarity from this point onward. Harry's actions, filled with extreme moral dilemmas, provide fertile ground for contrasting the philosophical approaches we've examined. While the authors often agree on broad principles, their interpretations diverge on important details, particularly in how they weigh absolute rules, practical consequences, and situational contexts. Ross argues that morality consists of prima facie duties, which are initial obligations, but can be overridden by more important duties depending on the context. He believes that morality requires practical discernment, as there is no fixed hierarchy of duties, but rather a need for judgment when faced with conflicts. In the case of Harry Callahan, Ross would suggest that although Harry has a duty to respect the rights of the supposed potential murderer, the duty to save as many lives as possible could prevail, justifying his aggressive actions to protect the victims. Parfit proposes a compatibilist view between deontology and teleology, suggesting that morality involves both principles and consequences. In his work on What Matters, he explores how these two approaches can coexist, arguing that ethics should take into account both duties and outcomes, seeking a balance between them. For Parfit, Harry's actions, such as ignoring legal procedures, could be justified by the effectiveness teleology of his actions and by the preservation of essential values deontology such as safety and justice. Foote, influenced by Aristotelic ethics, emphasizes that morality should be analyzed in terms of human virtues such as justice and courage, and depends on the context in which they are applied. In Virtues and Vices and Other Essays in Moral Philosophy, she discusses how virtues must be adapted to circumstances, rejecting approaches that seek a rigid, universal morality. Foote might criticize the summary execution of Scorpio, but she would recognize that, in a context of institutional failures and prevailing injustices, Harry's actions could be morally acceptable, considering the collapse of the legal order. Nagel explores the tension between the subjective and objective perspectives in his work Moral Questions. He argues that morality cannot be reduced to universal principles, as it involves dilemmas that need to take into account both the individual context and objective norms. For Nagel, Harry's frustration with the legal system represents a moral tragedy, where his actions may be understood from a subjective point of view, but are not justified from an objective standpoint, as they transgress fundamental principles of justice and legality. We can still go deeper and dissect the protagonist's specific actions. Harry Callahan is confronted with a series of moral dilemmas in his pursuit of justice. As previously mentioned, he often ignores the law and adopts questionable methods, such as the use of violence and summary execution to deal with criminals. Let us begin with one of his most controversial actions: the beating of Scorpio to obtain information. In the case of Harry beating Scorpio to extract information about the kidnapped victim, Kant's analysis is rigorous. For Kant, this action is entirely unacceptable. Torture treats the suspect as a means to an end, which is incompatible with the categorical imperative, which demands that people be treated always as ends in themselves and never as means. Even if the intention to save a life is good, the act of torturing cannot be justified, as it violates universal moral principles. Kant would reject any exception for such behavior, as he maintains that morality must be grounded in universal rules without flexibility for specific contexts. On the other hand, Mill, when applying utilitarianism, would evaluate the action based on its consequences. He would consider that if the torture of Scorpio led to the rescue of the victim and the reduction of suffering for many people, the act could be justified. However, Mill would also weigh the social effects of such an action, considering that by legitimizing torture, society could suffer more negative long-term consequences. For Mill, morality depends on maximizing happiness and overall well-being, but he would recognize that actions like torture have implications that go beyond immediate benefits. Ross, in his theory of prima facie duties, would adopt a more flexible approach. He would argue that the duty to save the victim's life is more urgent and could justify the torture of Scorpio, which, while a moral duty, is not absolute. The duty to save lives could outweigh the duty not to inflict pain, but Ross would emphasize that this action needs to be justified by an extreme situation and analyzed within the context. He would still defend that moral obligations cannot be ignored, but they can be hierarchized in exceptional circumstances. Parfit, who proposes a synthesis between deontology and consequentialism, would analyze the situation in a hybrid way. He would agree that the consequences of saving the victim are crucial, but would also consider the principles violated by torturing 𝕸𝖐𝖆. Parfit would believe that an ethical balance is required, one that takes into account both the consequences of the action and the preservation of fundamental moral values. Therefore, the torture of 𝕸𝖐𝖆 could be justified, but Parfit would not accept a complete violation of ethical principles. Foot, with her emphasis on virtues and context, would analyze the situation based on Harry's character and the virtues he must cultivate. She would criticize the torture as it would compromise virtues like temperance and justice, but she would recognize that in extreme situations there might be moral flexibility. Foot would emphasize that morality depends on how the action affects the agent's character, and Harry could be seen as someone acting with the intention to protect, but who also risks compromising his own morality. 𝕸𝖐𝖆𝖊𝑑, who explores moral dualism, would see the torture of 𝕸𝖐𝖆 as an example of moral tragedy. He would recognize the tension between Harry's subjective perspective, which seeks to save the victim at any cost, and the objective perspective, which requires adherence to universal moral norms. 𝕸𝖐𝖆𝖊 would argue that Harry's action is understandable given the urgency and desire for justice, but still morally problematic as it violates fundamental ethical principles. For 𝕸𝖐𝖆𝖊, torture is an ethical tragedy inevitable, but not justifiable. Regarding Harry's disregard for legal procedures, we can observe that the protagonist often acts outside the law, justifying his actions by the failure of the judicial system. For Kant, any disrespect for legal norms would be unacceptable. Morality for Kant is closely tied to the adherence to universal laws, and he considers obedience to the law as a necessary condition for morality. Even if the judicial system fails, Harry's morality is linked to his observance of the law, and the transgression of rules regardless of their effectiveness would be a moral error. 𝕑𝖆, with his focus on consequences, would view the violation of norms as justifiable if it results in significant benefits for society, such as ensuring safety or justice. However, he would caution about the long-term impact of weakening trust in the legal system and established norms. 𝕑𝖆 would weigh the social effects and the consequences of undermining the authority of the law, even though he recognizes that in some cases, disobedience might lead to greater collective happiness. Ross, with his theory of prima facie duties, would accept the violation of legal rules if a more important duty, such as protecting lives or preventing a crime, justifies the action. However, he would require that Harry carefully reflect on the moral implications of his actions, considering that although the law is a prima facie duty, it can be overridden by more urgent duties. Ross would be more flexible than Kant, but would still demand a rigorous moral analysis. Parfit, seeking an integration of deontology and consequentialism, would argue that Harry must consider both deontological principles, such as following the law, and the results of his actions. He would analyze the violation of the law as a morally complex choice that needs to be weighed in a balanced way, taking into account both immediate benefits and long-term implications. Foot, focusing on virtues, would see disrespect for the law as a threat to the virtue of justice, which relies on the adherence to social norms. However, she would recognize that in extreme situations, such as the failure of the system, Harry's morality could be more flexible. Foot would focus on Harry's character and how his actions impact his virtue, particularly in times of institutional crisis. 𝕸𝖐𝖆𝖊 would view the disregard for legal norms as a moral dilemma, emphasizing the conflict between the need for immediate justice and the duty to follow objective norms. He would see Harry as someone caught in a moral tragedy, where his need to act based on his own convictions conflicts with the demands of objective morality. At the climax of the film, perhaps one of the most questionable actions of the anti-hero is his summary execution of 𝕸𝖐𝖆. When Harry kills 𝕸𝖐𝖆, he takes justice into his own hands, frustrated by the failure of the judicial system. Kant would consider this execution unacceptable as it represents a violation of institutional justice. For Kant, punishment should be determined by universal laws and the legal process, and such unilateral action would undermine the morality of the justice system. 𝕑𝖆 could justify the execution if it were seen as a measure to prevent future crimes and ensure public safety. However, he would question whether the practice of summary executions would undermine society's trust in legal institutions and human rights. Mill would weigh the social consequences of legitimizing such an extreme punishment. Ross would accept the execution if it were seen as necessary to protect lives or prevent a greater harm, but he would emphasize that the decision should be carefully considered and properly justified. He would argue that, although the execution violates the principle of respecting the legal process, in extreme situations, it could be justified by the need to ensure the greater good. Parfit would analyze the execution as a morally problematic choice as it involves sacrificing important ethical principles to achieve an immediate good. Parfit would warn about the risks of eroding fundamental values, even in situations of great urgency, and would suggest that Harry carefully reflect on the consequences of his action. Foote would view the summary execution as a violation of the virtues of temperance and justice, as executing without a proper trial undermines due process. However, she would recognize that in situations of institutional failure, Harry's actions could be morally acceptable, albeit imperfect. 𝕸𝖐𝖆𝖊𝑑 finally would view the execution as an inherent tragedy, once again an ungrateful choice in which Harry, driven by a sense of personal justice, finds himself forced to transgress ethical norms in the name of immediate necessity. 𝕸𝖐𝖆𝖊 would understand Harry's frustration, but would still see his action as morally problematic as it would compromise fundamental principles of objective morality. Finally, there is the chase of the school bus, where Harry risks the lives of innocent children to capture Scorpio, presenting yet another difficult moral dilemma. For Kant, this action would also be unacceptable, as he would reject the idea of unnecessarily putting lives at risk, violating the moral principle of respect for human dignity. Acting recklessly in pursuit of a personal goal, capturing Scorpio, is not justified, as Harry would be using the children as mere means to an end. Mill, on the other hand, would adopt a utilitarian perspective, evaluating the consequences of Harry's actions. If the risk of the chase could result in capturing Scorpio and preventing future crimes, Mill might justify the action. However, he would also consider the long-term negative effects of a society where risking the lives of innocents is deemed acceptable, as it could undermine public trust in the justice system and the values associated with it. For Parfit, the situation would represent an ethical dilemma of balancing the protection of innocent lives with the need to capture a dangerous criminal. He would seek a solution that integrates both deontological and teleological principles, evaluating the consequences of the action without losing sight of fundamental moral duties. Foote, when analyzing the pursuit, would emphasize the violation of the virtues of prudence and justice. While recognizing Harry's intent to seek justice, she would question the morality of the action, as the recklessness of putting innocent lives at risk represents a flaw in Harry's character. 𝕸𝖐𝖆𝖊 would view this pursuit as a moral tragedy, where Harry's dilemma between acting to capture Scorpio and protecting innocent lives would create an inevitable moral suffering. Although his intentions are understandable, Harry's action would compromise fundamental moral principles in the name of immediate justice. Expanding further the depth and nuances of this analysis, both situations, the torture of Scorpio and the chase of the school bus, reveal asymmetries in ethical responses, as they involve different types of moral conflicts. The torture of Scorpio, despite directly violating fundamental ethical principles, is analyzed from the perspective of a justification based on consequences, with some theories accepting the violation in exceptional situations. The pursuit of the school bus, on the other hand, presents a situation where the risk to innocent lives is a decisive factor, making it more difficult to justify the action from any ethical perspective. Both cases, however, illustrate the complexity of morality in extreme situations and how different theories can offer distinct responses, depending on their emphasis on principles, consequences, or virtues. The ethical asymmetry between these two situations largely arises from the nature of the dilemma. In the case of torture, the conflict is between the immediate suffering of a criminal and the saving of a life, while in the pursuit the dilemma revolves around protecting innocent lives against the risk of a potentially greater harm by allowing the escape of the murderer. In summary, the subtle differences between the authors primarily lie in their ethical priorities. Kant emphasizes non-negotiable principles, Mill focuses on practical outcomes, Ross considers the weighing of duties, Parfit seeks compatibility between rules and ends, Foote highlights virtues shaped by context, and 𝕸𝖐𝖆𝖊 explores the conflict between objective and subjective perspectives. Harry's actions, while motivated by a quest for justice, challenge each approach in unique ways, illustrating the complexity of morality in extreme scenarios. Finally, in the concluding considerations, we face the bitter reality that the balance between deontology and teleology is sometimes a precarious illusion, a fine line that unravels in the face of urgent action. Kant, with his strict defense of the inviolability of rules, calls for a world where morality does not bend, yet also pushes us toward the abyss of negative and inflexible consequences. Mill, with his obsession for outcomes, attempts to build bridges, but reminds us of the fragility of a system that sacrifices integrity for ephemeral happiness and uncontrollable utility. Ross, Parfit, Foote, and Nagel, with their hybrid approaches, attempt to reconcile what seems impossible, weighing duties, circumstances, and virtues. Yet in the end, they all leave certain openings as they try to reconcile moral complexity with human limitations, leaving it to each individual to judge with reason and patience. In Dirty Harry, the protagonist's choices are not merely reflections of ethical dilemmas, but a dark window into the abyss of collapsing morality. His actions, while possibly justified in a limited way from both a deontological and teleological perspective, are tainted by the transgression of fundamental principles, disregard for consequences, and the brutality in destroying the virtues that uphold society. The film does not provide easy answers, but rather an unrelenting reflection on the fragility of morality when confronted with violence and desperation. It exposes, with a painful clarity akin to the midday sun, that ethical decisions in extreme situations rarely fit into any simple system of right or wrong. Instead, they reveal the cruel psychological and sociocultural truth that at times the very pursuit of justice can disintegrate the very pillars upon which it is built.